So, I want to talk about something that I think is generally one of the most misunderstood topics in vegan baking, and that is fat. Specifically, what fat actually does in pastry and why swapping butter for something plant-based isn't just a one-to-one decision, because sometimes it works beautifully and sometimes you end up with a greasy, collapsed mess and no idea why. So, let's actually talk about it. First, a quick reset. When we talk about fat in pastry, we are not just talking about flavor, we're talking about function. Fat does different jobs depending on that context. It creates layers, tenderizes, it traps air and builds structure in ganache. And each of those jobs has different requirements. The main thing to understand is this. Fat behavior in pastry is controlled almost entirely by two things: melting point and its solid fat content at a given temperature. Those two numbers tell you almost everything about how a fat is going to perform. Butter, for example, has a melting point somewhere around 32 to 35 degrees Celsius. It's solid when cold, it softens in your hands, and it melts completely in the oven early in the bake. That curve, which is that gradual transition from solid to liquid, is what makes it so versatile. Plant fats don't all share that curve, and that's where things get interesting. Let's start with lamination, like you see in croissants, because this is where fat behavior matters most and where vegan baking has the steepest hill to climb. Lamination works by sandwiching a solid fat between layers of dough. When that hits a hot oven, steam is generated, the fat melts, and these layers puff apart. But here's the thing, the fat needs to stay plastic during the folding process, and by plastic I mean pliable, not brittle, not melting in the dough. If it's too hard, it shatters and breaks through the layers. But on the flip side, if it's too soft, it smears in and you lose the laminate entirely. Butter nails this because of that gradual melt curve, and its water content, which is roughly 15 to 18%, is what contributes directly to steam. What about coconut oil though? It melts at around 24 degrees Celsius, which means in a warm kitchen, it's already approaching liquid. You can see here, it's liquidy. You try to laminate with it and you're folding grease into the dough. It will smear. Refined solid coconut oil behaves slightly better because the refining process raises the melting point a little and strips out some of the volatility. But it's still not great for lamination because it goes from solid to liquid very fast. There's almost no plastic range. Cacao butter, on the other hand, melts around 34 to 38 degrees Celsius, which puts it closer to dairy butter's range. It's firmer at room temp and it has a sharper mold. Very little plastic range, which makes it tricky to work with, but it's more structurally viable for lamination than coconut oil is. The thing that actually works best for vegan lamination is a good vegan block butter, one that's been specifically formulated with the blend of plant fats to mimic butter's melt profile. Brands like Naturally or BioLife have done this reasonably well. They're not identical to dairy butter, but they behave in comparable way. If you're making vegan croissants, this is your fat, not coconut oil and definitely not margarine spread. So, quick tip for you, work cold and work fast. Vegan block butter tends to have a slightly narrower workable temperature than dairy butter. If your kitchen is warm, chill your dough and your fat between every fold. Don't try to push it. Shortcrust is a different conversation entirely. Here, fat isn't being layered, it's being rubbed in or creamed, and its job is to coat the flour proteins and limit gluten development. That's what gives a shortcrust its tender, crumbly texture. Because you're not relying on lamination or steam, you have more flexibility. Coconut oil can actually work here, particularly refined coconut oil, which has neutral flavor. The solid fat to dough ratio matters, and you need to work it cold, but it can give you a short, crumbly texture that's perfectly acceptable for a tart shell. Vegan block butter also works very well in shortcrust and tends to give you the most butter-like flavor and a more cohesive dough that's easier to handle. Where people go wrong is using liquids like olive oil or sunflower oil, because these coat the flour too completely. You end up with a dough that's either greasy, overly tight, or completely fall apart on unmolding. Some Italian-style pastries are made intentionally with olive oil, but that's a different dough architecture altogether, not a substitute for a classic short crust. For a pâte sucrée with vegan block butter, treat your fat temperature the same way you would with dairy. Cold fat for a crumblier, more shortbread-like texture, slightly softened fat for a smoother, more pliable dough that's easier to line things with. Choux is where a lot of people don't expect fat to matter much because you're using a relatively small amount, but it actually absolutely does. The fat in choux is added to the hot water and milk mixture before the flour goes in. Its job is to coat the starch granules and control how much they absorb water, which affects the final texture of the paste and the structure of the baked shell. For choux, you want a fat that emulsifies well into the hot liquid and doesn't separate. Again, vegan block butter works very well here. Refined coconut oil can work, but because it has no water content and no emulsifiers, you can get a slightly denser paste and less open crumb. What I would avoid is unrefined coconut oil. The flavor bleeds through quite noticeably in choux because choux is relatively neutral dough and it amplifies whatever fat you use. Quick tip, whatever fat you're using, don't rush into drying out stage after you add the flour. You need to cook that paste over heat until it pulls cleanly away from the sides of the pan and there's a slight film on the bottom. That step is what drives off excess moisture and gives the choux enough structure to hold the shape once you pipe it. Ganache is essentially an emulsion. Fat droplets suspended in water-based liquid, usually cream. In the vegan world, you're typically replacing cream with plant-based alternatives like coconut cream, oat cream, or cashew cream, and that swap has real consequences. The fat content and composition of your plant cream changes how ganache sits. Coconut cream is relatively high fat, which means it often makes a firmer ganache than oat cream, which is a lower fat and higher in carbohydrates. If you're making a truffle or sliceable ganache tart filling and you switch creams without adjusting, you might end up with something too soft to set properly. Cacao butter is worth understanding in this case because it's one of the primary fats inside dark chocolate itself and is also sometimes added to ganache to firm it up. Cacao butter is unusual in that it's highly crystalline. It wants to form very specific crystal structures, which is why tempering chocolate is such a precise process. In a ganache, you're not tempering, so you don't need to worry about that, but knowing that cacao butter contributes to firmness and clean snap is useful when you're troubleshooting. Let me know if you would be interested in a deep dive of chocolates. If your vegan ganache is consistently too soft, the fix is usually one of three things: increase the chocolate ratio, add a small amount of cacao butter, or switch to a higher fat plant cream. Quick chef tip: let your ganache cool to around 35 degrees before you pour it into a tart shell. That window just below the melt point is where you get the smoothest, most even surface. So, the short version, fat and pastry isn't one thing and plant fats aren't one thing either. Every fat comes with its own melt point, its own water content, its own behavior in the oven, and if you understand those properties, you can make much better decisions about when a swap will work and when it will not. Coconut oil in lamination is generally no. A good vegan block butter, on the other hand, is generally yes. Cacao butter in ganache to adjust firmness is worth knowing, and always work cold. If you want to go deeper on any of these applications, I've got full recipe videos on vegan tart shells, chocolate ganache, and an entremet series linked below. See you in the next one.